Chapter 21, The Quilt That Walked the Golden. Ma and Aunt Catherine soaked in the afternoon sunlight that came through the windows in Mrs. Bonner's shop. Golden sewing supplies. It was in the upstairs room of what Pa had named the hatchet block. The frame was small, and every so often the women stood to roll up a completed section and expose a new portion of the quilt. Ma looked down at Tommy, who was sleeping in the basket beside her, then stretched and sat down again beside Aunt Catherine. Mrs. Bonner picked up her needle and took several tiny stitches, but before she could pull the thread through the fabric sandwich of quilt top batting and backing, she stood up to greet a customer. It had been like that all afternoon. Mrs. Bonner would take a few stitches, then someone would climb the stairs to the store and ask for a spool of thread or a yard of calico. "Emmy Blue, do you want to sit down and stitch for a few minutes?" Ma asked. I had been putting away thimbles and buttons and spools of thread. This was what Mrs. Bonner's second shipment of merchandise. The first had all but sold out in a month. She paid me $1 a week to help in the store after school and on Saturdays. "I have to finish this," I said, and Ma and Aunt Catherine smiled. They knew I was better at stocking shelves than I was at sewing. I smiled back at them as I placed the egg rock on a paper pattern to keep it from blowing away. The egg rock was the one that Joey had given me when he left our wagon train, and I had in turn given it to Mrs. Bonner the day the store opened. It was for good luck, I explained. Ma ran her hand over the quilt she was working on. It was a giant star made from pieces of the dresses we'd worn on the Overland Trail. "Remember this one, Kat?" She tapped her finger on a white sprig on a black background. "This was going to be my best dress when I reached Golden. And this red was from Emmy Blue's middle dress. Back in Quincy, you made a dress for Waxy from those yard goods too," I said. "She still has hers. Waxy wasn't as hard on clothes as I was." "Nobody is," Ma said with a smile. Aunt Catherine held up a green diamond shape. "That's the dress that was scorched in the campfire that first week of our trip. I learned to be careful after that," she recalled. Mrs. Bonner finished helping her customer who admired the quilt before she left. She also told Ma that she'd be back later in the week to give her a hand with the stitching. "You better hurry up and finish before she comes back," Mrs. Bonner said after the woman was gone. "She takes toenail stitches." When Ma didn't understand, Mrs. Bonner explained, "Stitches big enough to catch your big toe. You'd have to take them out." We all laughed. I glanced around the shop. It was small and it still smelled of newly sawed wood, but it was cheerful with the bright bolts of fabric stacked on shelves, the glass case of multicolored trims, and Ma's quilt on the wall. The day Mrs. Bonner had opened for business, Ma had brought her friendship quilt to hang in the shop. "Whenever I sit here to quilt," she had said, "I can look up at it and remember my friends, and one or two of your customers might get the idea they would want one. Where do you suppose they would buy the fabrics for it?" she grinned. Now Ma looked at Mrs. Bonner, who was so happy she almost glowed. She hadn't seen Mr. Bonner since the day she came to live with us. "Never should I have married such a man, but he's gone out of my remembrance now," she told us. "I expect we can finish this quilt today," Ma told Mrs. Bonner. She tapped her foot at the piano music that came through the floor. "Who would have thought I'd be doing my quilting over a saloon? But I like the music. It's snappy." Pa had rented to a saloon. There was a bank in the space next to it, and 2 doctors and a lawyer rented space upstairs from it, next to the sewing shop. It was a grand building, 2 stories high, made of brick and wood with plate glass windows in front. Ma had written to Grandma Mouse that the hatchet block was a great success. Tommy woke up and cried a little. Ma started to put aside her needle, but I said I'd take care of him. I picked him up and said, "Look at that big quilt, Tommy," but he only sniffled, no more interested in quilting than I'd been back in Quincy. I jiggled the baby and showed him to Bare Bones, who was stretched out nearby. In a moment I laid Tommy in his basket where he fell asleep. I went back to my work, listening to Ma, Aunt Catherine, and Mrs. Bonner. Although I still wasn't crazy about stitching, I liked the talk that went on around the quilt frame, the friendliness. I decided that was the best part of quilting. At last the three women stood up and loosened the quilt. Ma took it out of the frame and held it up. "Done," she said. The women clapped, and Bare Bones thumped his tail. The quilt was a single large star made up of hundreds of diamond shapes cut from the dresses we'd worn on our trip from Quincy to Golden. It was a happy quilt, and I thought it would always remind me of my quilt walk across the plains. Looking back on it, I decided that quilting as I walked along beside the wagons hadn't been such a bad thing. In fact, I'd almost enjoyed it. "What is that pattern?" Mrs. Bonner asked. "I believe it's called Lone Star," Aunt Catherine told her. "What an ordinary name. We can do better than that," Mrs. Bonner said. "We could call it Starry Night on the Prairie," Ma said. "I love lying on the ground and looking up at the stars. I believe that's why I made another star quilt." "Or Prairie Star," Aunt Catherine suggested. Ma nodded. "Something like that." She ran her hand over the star. Who would believe the pieces of this quilt came from dresses we worn one on top of another as we walked beside the wagons on our way to Golden. "That's it, Ma," I said. I shoved a bolt of cloth into place. "That's what, Emmy Blue?" "The name of the quilt." "I don't understand," Ma said. "What name?" I went over to the quilt then and touched a diamond that had come from the fabric of the first dress I put on that last morning in Quincy, a blue calico. "This quilt shouldn't have a star name at all," I said. "We're going to call it The Quilt That Walked to Golden." That's the end. I'm going to read a note from the author and just the end of the story. They named the quilt, we're going to call it The Quilt That Walked to Golden. A note from the author. There really was a quilt that walked. The girl who may have made it was Alice Burgess. In 1864, Alice's father, Thomas Burgess, and his brother Jacob set out from Ohio for Golden, Colorado. The two men planned to build a business block which would provide space for stores and offices. The two Burgess wagons were filled with building supplies, and the brothers told their wives, both of them named Mary, that there was no room for clothing. The women would be allowed to take only what they could wear. So the two wives put on all their dresses, one on top of another, and they all set out for Colorado. Because riding in a wagon was boring and the seat was hard, the women walked most of the way. Alice probably walked too. Family legend says that after the clothes wore out, Mary Jane, Thomas's wife, cut them into diamond shapes and made a quilt of them. The quilt was known as the Quilt That Walked to Golden. It is now in the collection of the Rocky Mountain Quilt Museum in Golden, Colorado. Like many quilt stories, this one seems to be as much legend as fact. Some of the fabrics in the quilts were not manufactured until long after 1864, and while Mary Jane probably cut out many of its pieces, the quilt may have been put together after her death by her daughter or granddaughter. Nobody really knows for sure. The combination of truth and family stories is what makes quilt history fun. I wrote about Mary Jane Burgess and her quilt in my 2004 History of Colorado Quilting, The Quilt That Walked to Golden. Jacob and his wife Mary left Golden before 1870. Thomas and Mary Jane stayed on for many years with their daughter Alice, as well as two sons. Thomas operated the Burgess block as a saloon, store, and public hall. Later it became a hotel and restaurant. The building at 1015 Ford Street still stands. It has been turned into apartments. When I wrote The Quilt That Walked to Golden, I was intrigued by a girl, Alice. What would the trip have been like for her? Did she have adventures on the way? Did she help her mother cut up dresses for the star quilt? And did she eventually become a quilter herself? Information about Alice and her family is sketchy. I wanted to know more about her, so when Amy Lennox, senior editor at Sleeping Bear Press, approached me about writing a children's book, I jumped at the chance to create a girl who walks across the prairie with her family to Colorado. Although the quilt walk is based on a real a real incident in Colorado history. The book is mostly a work of fiction. That's why I changed the names. I thought it wasn't fair to make up stories about real people, so Alice became Emmy Blue, and her parents became Maggie and Thomas Hatchet. Emmy Blue's adventures came from my imagination. And that was a good story by The Quilt Walk by Sandra Dallas. The end. I hope y'all enjoyed it. I enjoyed reading it. See y'all later.